The streetlights were still on when Daniel Rowe vanished in Westminster, London, on an early autumn night in 1993, the Central Administrative District, so quiet that it seemed nothing bad could possibly happen. Around nearly 11 o'clock at night, a few passers-by saw the 28-year-old man leave the Whitehall area, walking steadily, without haste, without anyone accompanying him, his figure gliding across the boundary between the yellow light and the darkness of Parliament Street. Daniel followed the familiar route, as on any other night, back straight, arms relaxed, not looking back, showing no sign of unease. There was no shout, no argument, no car pulling up, just a very ordinary moment, ending with Daniel disappearing from the last human sight of him. What happened after those footsteps would force Westminster to examine itself for decades to come, as a seemingly meaningless disappearance gradually revealed dark corners that no one wanted to acknowledge. Before delving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Westminster, London. An early autumn night in 1993 passed quietly like any other, the central administrative district of the capital cloaked in a rare tranquility. After the daytime crowds had departed, the government buildings standing motionless under the pale yellow sodium lights, the Whitehall roadway dry, devoid of engine noise, only the faint whisper of wind along the iron railings and the cold stone steps. Daniel Rowe, 28 years old, stepped out of the Whitehall area near Parliament Street around nearly 11 o'clock at night, ending a day of work that was in no way unusual, without haste, without tension, and bearing no sign of an important meeting or an unexpected plan. He was last seen at the intersection between the streetlight and the darkness, where the path opened towards smaller streets, a time late enough for the city to begin closing down, but not so late that the presence of a man walking alone would draw attention. Daniel's gait was normal, back straight, arms relaxed, steps even, with no hurry or hesitation, nor any movement of turning to look behind as if aware of someone. He paused very briefly at the curb, glanced towards Parliament Street, then turned in the familiar direction he had taken on previous nights, a turn that gave no sense of anything wrong or uneasy, merely the natural choice of someone utterly familiar with the area. There was no argument, no loud call, no unusual sound breaking the quiet atmosphere, and no one recorded anyone following closely behind Daniel in that moment. Westminster continued to sink into the slow breathing of the night, while Daniel Rowe stepped out of the final frame of view of those who had seen him, never to reappear. Time began to pass in a way that at first no one noticed, the initial minutes merely an ordinary delay, then becoming an incomprehensible silence. When Daniel did not return home at his usual hour, the telephone did not ring, the door did not open, and his familiar room remained exactly as it had been when he left. The family waited, reassuring themselves that perhaps he had stopped somewhere, perhaps a late train, perhaps an unplanned prolonged conversation, but as the clock passed midnight and moved towards dawn, patience began to give way to worry. Calls were made, first to friends, then to familiar places, but all led to the same answer: no one had seen Daniel, no one had heard anything from him. The atmosphere in the house grew heavy, each stretch of silence lengthening a little more, each passing minute carrying the feeling that something was wrong, though no one could name it or point to the cause. When the dim light of early morning began to filter through the window frame, waiting was no longer an option, and Daniel's family were forced to confront the possibility they had tried to avoid all night. Daniel Rowe was not simply late. Finally, in a state of tension and unease, they picked up the telephone and called the police, officially reporting that Daniel Rowe had disappeared. Right from the first morning after Daniel Rowe's family reported the matter, the case was transferred to the police team responsible for the Westminster area, and from the initial minutes of accessing the file, the duty officers agreed among themselves that this was not an ordinary missing person case. Westminster was not a suburban residential area where adults could vanish daily without leaving much trace. It was the administrative political center of London, an area with high density of control, clear operational schedules, fixed patrol routes, and an almost unchanging nighttime rhythm. Daniel Rowe disappeared here, and that very fact gave the initial report a quite different tone. The time he was last seen fell towards the end of the evening, not so late that all activity had ceased, but late enough for the number of witnesses to drop sharply, creating a dangerous overlap between normal and abnormal. The location of the disappearance further heightened the officers' alertness. The Whitehall, Parliament Street area was not a place where people usually got lost, nor a place where nameless incidents could easily occur without notice, at least in theory. And finally, the nature of the last scene. Daniel did not leave in a state of panic, with no sign of being coerced or publicly followed, no signal whatsoever that he was trying to avoid or flee something, making the possibility of a spontaneous incident harder to explain, rather than easier to rule out. From these factors, Westminster police quickly established a key missing person zone, rather than treating Daniel as someone who had gone somewhere and would return. The area around Whitehall, Parliament Street and nearby turning routes was ringed as the center of the case, not because there was specific evidence that something had happened there, but because it was the last point where Daniel existed in public life. The officers began doing what they always do in the early hours of a suspicious case, reconstructing the most certain milestones, eliminating the most obvious possibilities, and searching for anything that broke the assumption that it was merely harmless delay. There was no information about Daniel leaving London that night, no accident reports, no signal that he had proactively informed anyone of a change in plans. Even without a specific criminal indicator, the nature of the location and timing led the officers to believe that delaying a deeper investigation would be an unnecessary risk. Within the first 24 hours, an important operational decision was made. Daniel Rowe's file would not remain at the level of simply recording a missing person, but would be expanded into a suspicious investigation, allowing broader data collection and earlier mobilization of resources than usual for missing adults. This decision, on the surface, was a sign of caution and proactivity, reflecting the experience of those who understood that Westminster allowed few mistakes. However, alongside that correct step, another assumption was accepted almost immediately, quietly seeping into the entire handling of the case. That was the assumption that if something had happened to Daniel, it must be directly tied to the area where he was last seen, and that any significant development had occurred in the very short time after the moment he turned off Whitehall. This assumption sounded reasonable, it fitted geographical logic, fitted investigative experience in tightly monitored areas, and fitted the feeling that a person could not vanish in the middle of Westminster without leaving a trace, unless something had happened right there. But that very reasonableness meant the assumption went unquestioned in the early stage. The officers began viewing every new piece of data through that lens, arranging timelines and accounts in a way that reinforced the belief that Daniel's final turn was also the key point of the entire case. No one in the first 24 hours realized that by accepting this assumption too soon, they had inadvertently narrowed their own scope of thinking, locking the case into a logical framework that seemed solid but had never been tested. As the first day drew to a close, Daniel Rowe's disappearance had officially been labeled suspicious, an important step forward from passive waiting. But at the same time, a dangerous seed had been planted in the file, the belief that the answer, if it existed, must lie right where Daniel was last seen. That assumption would accompany the case for many years afterwards, quietly directing decisions, priorities, and what was overlooked, becoming a long shadow that no one on that early autumn morning in 1993 could have foreseen. Immediately after the file was shifted to a suspicious investigation, the Westminster police team set about the work they believed would bring order to a still vague case, reconstructing the timeline, not by assumption or intuition, but by every last minute that Daniel Rowe still existed in verifiable space. They started from the milestones regarded as most certain, the points that in initial perception left almost no room for dispute. The time Daniel left the Whitehall area, the position where he was last seen, the direction he turned, and the reasonable time for him to leave the area, if there had been no intervention. These data were placed side by side, cross-checked against Daniel's habits in the preceding weeks, with the aim of finding a familiar pattern from which to deduce the anomaly. On paper, everything seemed to fit. Daniel usually left at that hour, usually walked similar routes, and usually disappeared from others' sight after only a few tens of seconds on less frequented stretches. The initial timeline looked neat, seamless, giving the impression that the case was being placed on a solid data foundation. From the official last seen point, the officers extended the timeline forward, estimating where Daniel might have been after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, based on average walking speed and the most logical turns in the Westminster area. However, when they tried to fill this timeline with independent confirming data, rather than inference, mismatches began to appear. There were stretches of 10 to 15 minutes where no witness could confirm having seen Daniel, nor was there any indirect sign that he had passed through positions logic suggested he must have passed. At first, this caused no great concern, because in a wide and complex area like Westminster, a pedestrian going unnoticed for a few minutes was entirely possible. But when the officers placed those gaps beside each other, linking them into a continuous chain, they began to realize this was no longer random data deficiency, but a suspicious pattern. Stretches of road assumed to have passers-by, with lighting and relatively good visibility, were completely devoid of any observational trace related to Daniel, even a vague memory or supporting detail. The timeline on paper still existed, but under close scrutiny it resembled a road drawn in disconnected segments, where the joins existed only in inference rather than reality. To understand better, the investigation team returned to the pivotal point of the entire file, the last seen milestone. This was the foundation of every assumption accepted in the first 24 hours, and the reason Whitehall was regarded as the center of the case. Upon re-examining how this milestone was established, the officers realized it was not based on irrefutable direct evidence, but on a chain of indirect confirmations, reasonable enough to be accepted early on, but not strong enough to withstand scrutiny when the timeline was built in minute detail. The person who saw Daniel last described his appearance, timing, and turn correctly, but could not confirm how far he went afterwards, nor rule out the possibility that Daniel continued moving out of the area in the following minutes without being noticed. When placing the last seen milestone into a more detailed timeline, its value began to shift. It remained accurate in the sense that Daniel had been there, but was no longer certain in the sense that it was where he ceased to exist in controllable space. Another time point, a few minutes later, gradually emerged as a reasonable possibility, though without sufficiently strong data to confirm. The gap became harder to explain clearly when the investigation team tried to answer the seemingly simple question, from the last seen position to the next logical point, how and in how long had Daniel traveled? Every possible route was examined, but each encountered the same problem. There was no data proving Daniel had actually passed through there in the corresponding time. No one remembered seeing him, no supporting detail suggested his presence, and no random factor, such as a minor incident or fleeting interaction, left a trace in others' memory. Gradually, the investigation team were forced to confront an uncomfortable realization. The first timeline did not reinforce the initial assumption as they had hoped, but instead exposed the fragility of that very assumption. If Daniel had truly vanished right at the last seen point, there should have been at least some sign, however small, of a sudden break in his movement. But what the timeline revealed was a gradual fading, a process of Daniel falling out of the official timeline without a clear moment of rupture. This led to a provisional but profoundly significant conclusion for the investigation direction. The last seen point might only be where Daniel was seen for the last time, not where he disappeared, and his leaving no trace afterwards did not prove something had happened there, but might indicate that the search was being locked into a position convenient in logic, but not reflecting the actual sequence of events. When the timeline was first completed, it did not bring the answer the investigation team expected, but forced them to accept that if they continued to regard Whitehall as the absolute epicenter of the case, they might be pursuing the solution in the wrong place from the very beginning. After the first timeline was reconstructed and revealed gaps that could not be filled, the investigation team were forced to step out of the safe zone of paper milestones to confront a more practical question. If Daniel Rowe did not vanish right at the recorded last seen point, then where did he go next? From that moment, the investigation shifted its focus to systematically screening every possible route, not by feeling or habitual guesswork, but by dissecting each choice Daniel might have made in the minutes after leaving Whitehall. Each route was treated as a branch of the same question, and the team's task was to confirm or eliminate them one by one, using only what could be verified, rather than what seemed reasonable. The first route examined was the Underground, the familiar and convenient option for anyone moving around central London. Officers began by identifying the nearest stations to the last seen point, calculating the walking time Daniel would have needed to reach each if he had chosen that method, and comparing them with the operating hours of the tube system that night. There were no reports of incidents, no information about a passenger drawing attention, and no sign that Daniel had hurried or altered his routine to catch a specific train. Checking the Underground lines yielded no direct leads, but it was not strong enough to completely rule out the possibility that Daniel had boarded at another station and vanished into the thin late-night crowds. However, when this possibility was placed alongside the gaps in the timeline, a problem arose. If Daniel had really entered the Underground, there should have been at least one confirmed timestamp of him leaving the surface area within a reasonable window. The complete absence of such a sign made this route more ambiguous than persuasive. The second route was on foot, the simplest option, and the one the initial file had implicitly favored. Daniel continued walking through the streets adjacent to Westminster, possibly turning onto larger thoroughfares or heading towards a familiar area. The team screened the main roads, calculated travel times, and cross-referenced them with what they knew of Daniel's usual movements. There were no traffic accident reports, no information about a pedestrian being struck or involved in an incident in the relevant time frame, and no indication that Daniel had been forced to stop midway. In terms of data, the Overground route provided no evidence of a clear event, but it raised another question. If Daniel had simply continued walking normally, why did no one see him on stretches where there should have been at least some passers-by, however few? The silence of the Overground route, rather than being eliminative, only prolonged the sense that Daniel had slipped out of sight in a way that defied ordinary logic. The third route, and the one that made the officers pause longest, was the network of minor paths around Westminster. The narrow streets, the connecting walkways between government buildings, the spaces few people noticed because they were not considered primary thoroughfares. These were paths Daniel might have known well if he worked regularly in the area, and places where a person could pass without drawing attention, especially late at night. Screening the minor paths required meticulous care, for there was no clear boundary between fully public space and semi-controlled areas. The officers checked every possibility, every turn, every reasonable time window, but the result was the same as with the other routes: no sign of an accident, no trace of a sudden incident, and no evidence that Daniel had been stopped or coerced on any of them. As each route was examined and failed to provide a definitive answer, the team began to shift from searching for what happened to determining what definitely did not happen. Daniel had left no sign of an accident. There was no evidence he suffered a medical emergency, and no trace suggesting he had left the area hurriedly or unusually. This ruled out many spontaneous scenarios, yet at the same time made the case harder to grasp, because absence of evidence was not the same as evidence of absence. During the screening process, an earlier decision in the file began to be re-examined in a new light. One route had been eliminated quite early, because it was deemed incompatible with the initial assumption that Daniel must have disappeared close to the last seen point. That decision, when made, had caused no controversy, for it fitted the conventional understanding of the area and timing. But when every other route led to the same void, the swift elimination of this one became noteworthy. The officers realized that by tying all reasoning so tightly to the assumption about the disappearance point, they had unwittingly allowed a viable route to drift out of serious consideration, not because it was impossible, but because it did not fit the logical framework accepted from the start. The fact that no accident was found on any route was no longer reassuring. It became an indicator that Daniel might have continued moving in a way that left no clear trace, at least not along the paths the early investigation had prioritized. When this screening phase ended, the team had no new concrete answers, but they did have a clearer awareness of what had been overlooked. If Daniel did not vanish where the file recorded, and if the main routes could not account for his absence, then discarding a route simply because it clashed with the initial assumption might have been a decisive mistake. From that point on, the investigation was forced to acknowledge that the problem was not which route Daniel took, but that they had viewed those routes through too narrow a lens, causing an important possibility to be sidelined before it could be properly understood. When the possible routes yielded no clear solution, the focus of the investigation fell back on the one element that still felt certain: the key witness, the person regarded as the golden link connecting Daniel Rowe to the outside world after he left Whitehall. This witness's statement had appeared early in the file, was carefully recorded, and quickly became the anchor for the entire initial assumption of the case. The witness described seeing Daniel within the time frame matching the last seen marker, at a reasonable location on what was believed to be his usual route, walking normally with no sign of distress. Every detail sounded so consistent that it almost invited no questions. The timing matched the predicted window, the location sat neatly inside the key missing person zone, and the description of the man matched what family and colleagues had confirmed. In the opening days, the statement was treated as a perfect piece of the puzzle, sufficient to reinforce the belief that Daniel had continued moving as the file assumed, and that his disappearance must have happened shortly afterwards, somewhere very close, very fast, and very suddenly. Officers used the statement to anchor the timeline, to eliminate certain routes, and to concentrate resources on the area they believed was the epicenter of the case. However, as the investigation deepened and the timeline gaps refused to close, the value of the statement began to be re-examined, not because it directly contradicted other data, but because it seemed too smooth in a picture that was increasingly cracking. The team returned to the original transcript, reading every sentence, every phrase, and placing them in the exact context of that moment. The nighttime lighting of Westminster, the distance between witness and subject, how long the actual observation lasted. They realized that most of the statement's weight did not rest on a single indisputable detail, but on how well it fitted the assumption accepted early on. The witness saw a man resembling Daniel walking in the expected direction, and because the file believed Daniel had to go that way, the statement was treated as strong confirmation. But when that assumption began to waver, the statement lost much of its certainty. The officers started asking whether they had used the statement to test the assumption, or the assumption to bolster the statement. In subsequent sessions, the witness was asked to return to clarify what seemed minor details: exact distance, angle of view, duration of observation, and factors that might affect identification in poor light. There was no major change in the account, no clear sign of lying, and no serious contradiction emerged immediately. This made doubting the statement difficult, for it showed no instability in the usual ways. Yet that very stability revealed another issue. The statement only described a very brief moment, enough to confirm Daniel had once been there, but not enough to establish how far he went afterwards, or what he did in the minutes that followed. The witness could not say for certain whether Daniel stopped, turned down another path, or interacted with anyone once out of sight. That gap, previously regarded as unimportant, now became pivotal, because the entire direction of the investigation depended on assuming nothing significant happened in that interval. When the statement was placed alongside the results of the route screenings, an imbalance gradually became clear. If the statement accurately reflected Daniel's journey in the assumed direction, the subsequent routes should have produced at least some observational trace, however small. But in reality, they were completely silent. No additional witnesses, no indirect signs, no data confirming Daniel's continued presence after the moment he was seen. The team began to realize that the statement, while not wrong in content, may have been given a role far too large, becoming the pillar for an assumption it had never itself verified. In other words, the statement was only valid in the context that the file believed Daniel took that route, and lost most of its value when that context no longer held. This realization did not lead to outright rejection of the statement, but forced the officers to view it far more cautiously. They began treating it as a single data point, rather than as directional evidence, and asked whether it was possible Daniel had been seen exactly as described, yet afterwards, left the assumed route in a way no one anticipated. This circled back to the issue that had emerged from the route screening, a route eliminated early because it clashed with the original assumption. If Daniel had actually taken that route, the witness's statement could still be accurate, but the file's interpretation of what the statement meant would be wrong. In that light, the key witness was no longer the person confirming where Daniel disappeared, but merely the person confirming one moment of existence before he slipped out of the investigation's field of vision. This produced a subtle yet profound shift in how the team viewed the file. They realized that all along, the statement had been used as an anchor to keep the case stationary in a convenient position, rather than as a milestone from which to broaden reasoning. There was no indication the witness had deliberately given false information, but neither was there grounds to believe the statement was strong enough to lock the investigation's direction. When the phase of working with the key witness ended, the team had no new data in the traditional sense, but they did have one vital adjustment in understanding the case. If the statement only held value to the extent the initial assumption was correct, then continuing to rely on it to sustain that assumption was a dangerous loop. From that moment, the Daniel Rowe file entered a new phase, where every old detail, no matter how familiar, had to be re-examined in the light of what had been overlooked, and where false certainty gradually gave way to a harder but more honest question, not where Daniel was seen, but from that moment onward, which path he actually took that no one noticed. After the key witness's statement was returned to its proper place in the file, the investigation team were forced to seek another foothold, not to replace the old assumption with a new one, but to test reality in a more independent way. They went back to the least contentious elements of the entire case, the places Daniel Rowe certainly passed through that night, not because someone saw him, but because logic would not allow him to avoid them. This was not a traditional crime scene, no signs of violence, no cordon, but it was an indirect space tied to Daniel's disappearance, an intermediate point that, if ignored, would leave every hypothesis fragile. Identifying this point relied on combining timing, the last seen location, and the most reasonable movement choices Daniel could have made in the few minutes that followed, before all trace of him vanished from the record. The team were not looking for a dramatic moment, but for ordinariness, because within that ordinariness, anything that did not belong to Daniel could stand out. As they screened the area, the officers proceeded cautiously, treating it as a space hundreds of people had walked through since the night Daniel disappeared, where any traces, if they ever existed, risked being erased by time and daily activity. They did not expect to find anything so obvious it could be named immediately, but concentrated on recording every detail that did not match Daniel's habits and personal file. It was during this meticulous screening that a small but hard-to-ignore sign began to emerge, not as a shocking discovery, but as a subtle discrepancy between what should have been present and what actually was. The sign bore no characteristic of Daniel, did not fit his recorded lifestyle, and was not linked to any habit confirmed by family or colleagues. It was present in a position where Daniel, had he passed through, would certainly have left a different trace, or at the very least would not have left this one in that manner. At first, this discovery was recorded as a minor detail, for in a public space like Westminster, the appearance of signs unrelated to a specific individual was almost inevitable. But when placed in the context of the entire file, the officers began to recognize an important difference. This sign was not simply not belonging to Daniel, but also did not belong to the surrounding context in the usual way. It appeared at a reasonable intermediate point in the road, where Daniel might have paused very briefly, or passed through more slowly than normal, yet it bore characteristics indicating the presence of another factor, another action, not part of his familiar sequence of behavior. What drew the investigation team's attention was not the sign itself, but its timing and position too precisely placed to be ignored, and too divergent from Daniel's file to be dismissed as coincidence. When cross-referencing this discovery with the reconstructed timeline, one thing became clearer. The time gap previously seen as due to lack of witnesses now had a new anchor point, not enough to fill the gap, but enough to prove that during that interval, the space Daniel passed through had experienced interference from another factor. This said nothing about the nature of that interference, but it shattered the assumption that everything had proceeded entirely normally, until the moment Daniel vanished. If Daniel had passed this point, and if that sign did not belong to him, then there were only two possibilities. Either the sign appeared before Daniel arrived, or it appeared while he was there, linked to another presence the file had never seriously considered. Both possibilities shared one investigative consequence: Daniel was not alone in this space in the way the initial assumption had implicitly asserted. The discovery of a sign not belonging to Daniel at an indirect scene forced the investigation team to readjust how they understood his final minutes. Previously, the file had been built on the idea that Daniel left Whitehall, continued moving normally, and then disappeared in an inexplicable way somewhere nearby. Now that picture began to acquire a new overlay, where Daniel's journey might have intersected with another factor, not strong enough to create noise or draw attention, but sufficient to alter his direction. Notably, this discovery did not directly contradict the key witness's statement, nor negate the established timeline, but pointed out that both could be accurate within their scope, yet failed to fully reflect what actually occurred in the space between the milestones. For the investigation team, this was the first material discovery, albeit indirect, showing that Daniel's disappearance was not simply the story of one man walking out of others' sight. It was not enough to name a criminal act, not enough to identify a suspect, and not enough to change the case's label. But it had another, more important value at this stage. It proved that continuing to cling tightly to the initial assumption, where Daniel was seen as the sole figure in his final minutes, was no longer appropriate. This indirect scene, with its sign not belonging to Daniel, became the first point in the file where the presence of another factor was recorded seriously, opening the possibility that Daniel's disappearance was not the result of an empty moment, but the consequence of an intersection overlooked in the early days of the investigation. After the first discovery at the indirect scene, the investigation entered a phase that seemed more stable, not because answers had emerged, but because the officers finally felt they had enough pieces to construct a dominant scenario. This scenario did not appear spontaneously, it formed gradually, nurtured by what the file had allowed to be seen, and more importantly, by what the file had never forced them to confront. According to this scenario, Daniel Rowe left Whitehall, followed what was believed to be his familiar route, passed the intermediate point, where the strange sign was found, and then encountered a swift, discrete incident, sufficient to make him vanish without causing disturbance. No need for a public act of violence, no need for multiple witnesses, just a moment of misalignment in space and time was enough. This scenario was appealing because it explained many things at once: why there were no signs of an accident, why there were no clear witnesses, and why Daniel fell out of sight without leaving direct traces. It also aligned with the initial assumption accepted in the first 24 hours, that the incident, if it occurred, must be tied to the area near the last seen point, and happen in the very short time afterwards. Once this dominant scenario took shape, the investigation officially followed it with increasing focus. Scattered clues in the file began to be rearranged, not to challenge the scenario, but to reinforce it. The key witness's statement was reread as confirmation that Daniel had followed the assumed route. The discovery at the indirect scene was interpreted as evidence of interference occurring on that very route. The timeline gaps were seen as the natural consequence of a brief event too small to leave many traces. Each detail, when standing alone, could be interpreted in multiple ways, but when placed within the chosen scenario, they seemed to fit just enough to avoid suspicion. Data that did not fit perfectly were not discarded, but pushed to the margins, noted as unclear elements that would be clarified later, once more information reinforced the main scenario. The problem with this approach lay not in lack of care, but in excessive consistency. When a hypothesis becomes the pivot of an investigation, every new piece of data must find a place around that pivot, and anything that cannot is treated as noise. The sign not belonging to Daniel at the indirect scene, instead of being seen as a hint that another scenario might exist, was firmly attached to the dominant scenario as proof that the incident had happened right there. The timeline gaps, instead of forcing an expansion of the search scope, were understood as the result of missing witnesses in a very short interval. Even the early elimination of one route was seen as reasonable, since it did not fit the story being built. Gradually, the Daniel Rowe file became a closed structure, where every detail had its place, but only within the limits of one single interpretation. The danger of this phase was that it created a sense of progress, even though the scope of thinking was actually narrowing. The officers could point to why they believed in the dominant scenario, explain why each clue fitted it, and defend their choice against surface-level questions. But the deeper they dug in this direction, the more time and professional credibility they invested in proving that scenario correct. Harder questions, such as why Daniel left no sign after the intermediate point, or why there were no further witnesses on stretches assumed to have passers-by, were gradually raised more softly, as if the answer had already been tacitly accepted. The investigation did not stop, but it moved within a narrow corridor, where every alternative turn was seen as unnecessary or inefficient. It was within this consistency that a silent consequence began to form. Evidence was no longer used to test the hypothesis, but the hypothesis began shaping how evidence was understood. Ambiguous details were interpreted in the way most favorable to the dominant scenario, while uncomfortable details were treated as exceptions or unresolved technical issues. No one deliberately distorted data, but data, when viewed through a single lens, changed meaning on its own. A time gap was no longer a sign of a wrong direction, but evidence of the discrete nature of the assumed incident. A strange sign was no longer a reminder that another scenario might exist, but confirmation that the incident had occurred exactly where the file was focusing. By the end of this phase, the investigation into Daniel Rowe had a coherent story to tell, at least internally. It explained why he vanished, why no one saw anything clear, and why the search yielded no immediate results. But that very coherence concealed a worrying reality. If this dominant hypothesis was wrong, then not just one detail in the file was misinterpreted, but the entire interpretive system around it was skewed. Every piece of evidence, every statement, every gap had been bent to fit one single story, meaning that any truth lying outside that story would have little chance of being seen. When the hypothesis became the skeleton of the investigation, the Daniel Rowe file did not just follow one direction, it was locked into it, carrying the risk that anything incompatible would continue to be overlooked, not for lack of value, but because there was no longer room for it in the chosen narrative. Once the dominant investigative hypothesis had been established and become the pivot of the entire file, the emergence of a first suspect was almost an inevitable consequence. This person did not come from an explosive clue or sudden discovery, but gradually rose as the figure best fitting the scenario the investigation was pursuing. On paper, this person's profile combined the three elements the officers were seeking: opportunity, ability to access Daniel Rowe in the critical time frame, and behaviors deemed suspicious when placed in the context of the case. No clear motive was needed from the start, just a chain of reasonable coincidences was enough to turn a name into the center of investigative attention. This person appeared in the file, through what seemed a secondary branch of information, related to the intermediate area Daniel certainly passed through. They were not a relative, nor did they have any recorded personal relationship with Daniel, but they were present in the space and time close enough to be impossible to ignore. In the dominant hypothesis's interpretation, this was exactly the type of figure who could explain Daniel's swift and discreet disappearance, someone familiar with the area, able to approach without drawing attention, and flexible enough to leave without clear traces. The initial data showed no direct criminal act, but they were sufficient to create the feeling that this person's presence in the file was not random. As they dug deeper, the officers began building a chain of interpretation around the first suspect. Their opportunity was determined based on schedule and location, showing they could have been near Daniel during the timeline's empty interval. Access capability was reinforced by familiarity with the Westminster area, especially the minor paths few noticed that the investigation had previously identified. Suspicious behavior, though not clearly criminal, appeared just when the file needed an explanation for the gaps. Small changes in routine, contradictory details in accounts of whereabouts that night, and some reactions judged disproportionate upon learning of Daniel's disappearance. No single element was strong enough to stand alone, but strung together, they created a picture convincing enough to push the investigation into the phase of preparing action. The preparation for arrest did not happen hastily, but followed what was seen as a careful sequence. Officers gathered further statements, re-screened existing data, and tried to strengthen the file in line with the dominant scenario. Internally, a sense of approaching a turning point began to spread. Finally, after months of only gaps and assumptions, they had a specific name to focus on. The file was edited to highlight points unfavorable to the suspect, while neutral or hard-to-explain details were retained but not emphasized. The goal now was not just further investigation, but building a body of evidence solid enough to stand before prosecutors and justify an arrest decision. However, when the file was placed on the prosecutor's desk for legal feasibility assessment, weaknesses began to emerge in a way the investigation team could not ignore. Evidence regarded as pivotal internally proved fragile when separated from the dominant hypothesis that had nurtured it. Opportunity, when analyzed more rigorously, relied heavily on inference rather than independent confirmation. Area access, though reasonable, was not exclusive to the suspect and insufficient to prove presence at the exact required moment. Suspicious behaviors, when held to criminal evidence standards, became ambiguous. They could be explained in multiple ways, and did not necessarily lead to a conclusion of criminal conduct. The prosecutors raised questions the investigation, in its consistency, had avoided. Was there direct evidence placing the suspect with Daniel in the same space at the same time? Was there physical trace linking the suspect to Daniel's disappearance? Was there an independent witness confirming significant interaction between the two? Each question led to the same uncomfortable answer: no. What the file had was a chain of reasonable inference, but inference, however reasonable, was not enough to cross the threshold required for a strong legal action like arrest. Evidence once seen as sufficient within the dominant hypothesis now revealed itself as overly dependent on interpretation and unable to stand when detached from the story built around it. Having to stop at this stage created a major setback for the investigation. The first suspect, once seen as a potential solution to Daniel Rowe's disappearance, could not be brought to justice simply because the file lacked sufficient weight. This did not mean the person was innocent, but it forced the investigation to accept a hard truth. By building everything around one single scenario, they had created a body of evidence that appeared complete but actually depended on that very scenario to exist. When the scenario was questioned, the entire argumentative structure began to waver. After the arrest plan was shelved, the Daniel Rowe file fell into a dangerous state of suspension. The first suspect was no longer the center, but the assumptions that had led to identifying this person had not been fully dismantled. The investigation faced a difficult choice: either continue adjusting the file to try salvaging the dominant hypothesis with another suspect, or accept that the initial direction might have been wrong from the foundations. The evidence failing to hold up before prosecutors did not just eliminate one suspect, it exposed a deeper problem in the entire process. When a wrong hypothesis is used as the interpretive frame, it not only leads to mistaken conclusions, but also renders seemingly convincing evidence meaningless the moment it must face the rigorous standards of the law. The failure to arrest the first suspect left a heavy silence within the investigation team, but instead of creating a clear break, it led to a more dangerous state, continuing forward on the inertia of the old direction. Even though confidence in it had diminished, on paper, the dominant investigative hypothesis was not completely rejected. It was merely deemed insufficiently evidenced, and that very ambiguity caused the investigation to drift for many months in a direction that had begun to show signs of error. The officers continued to devote most of their time to re-screening details surrounding the first suspect and those with similar profiles, in the hope that a new piece would emerge to salvage the constructed scenario. But that did not happen. Each round of screening only repeated old data, reinterpreted with more cautious wording, but brought no breakthrough. Meanwhile, time passed quietly in the way most detrimental to a missing person case. Clues that had not been prioritized in the early phase began to grow cold, not because they lacked value, but because they had not been pursued in time. Possibilities outside the dominant hypothesis, especially the routes eliminated early, gradually became harder to access as witnesses' memories faded and the environment changed. Westminster, being a vibrant and constantly evolving space, did not remain static for a prolonged investigation. Small details that could have been confirmed in the first few days now became blurred, blending into the area's new rhythm of life. The officers began to realize that every week passing without a new direction was a week they lost the ability to verify things that should have been clarified early on. The prolonged focus on an increasingly unsteady direction also affected how new data were received. Sporadic information, even if not directly contradicting the file, but not fitting the dominant hypothesis, was often recorded at a low level, seen as not yet important enough to expand the investigation. This was not the result of indifference, but the natural consequence of a file already too clearly shaped in the previous phase. When all resources were poured into proving a specific scenario, other possibilities, though existing, had little chance of being properly recognized. Gradually, the investigation fell into a state where the officers still worked, still updated the file, but no longer moved closer to discovering what had actually happened to Daniel Rowe. The lost time was measured not only in months past, but in investigative opportunities gone forever. Questions that should have been asked while witnesses' memories were still fresh, while routes were less altered, and while the environment around the indirect scene retained more traces, could now only be revisited indirectly, with answers growing ever less certain. Each return to an old detail forced the team to confront the same reality. They were no longer standing at the same starting point as before, and any effort to reconstruct those first minutes after Daniel's disappearance was limited by the very time that had elapsed. Internally, fatigue gradually replaced the initial sense of urgency. No one officially admitted the direction had been wrong, but neither did anyone still believe that persisting a little longer in that direction would yield the answer. The Daniel Rowe file began to show familiar signs of a case cooling down: fewer urgent meetings, fewer prioritized resources, and many old assumptions retained because nothing was strong enough to replace them. This did not mean the case was forgotten, but it was no longer at the center of attention, as in the early months. While the investigation struggled with its own inertia, other clues, possibilities once identified but incompatible with the dominant scenario, gradually lost their viability. Spaces changed, people changed, and details that could once have been verified by action now existed only on paper. This created a vicious circle hard to break. The fewer new clues, the more the file depended on the old hypothesis, and the more it depended on the old hypothesis, the less able it was to recognize that time was being irretrievably lost. As the first months of the investigation drew to a close, there was no official moment marking the case veering in the wrong direction. No clearly mistaken decision, no action easily pinpointed as the direct cause. Instead, the wrong path formed from a series of reasonable choices at each moment, combining into a trajectory that took the investigation ever further from where it needed to look back. Daniel Rowe remained missing, the file remained open, but each passing day made finding the truth harder, not for lack of effort, but because time, once lost, rarely returns what it has taken. As the subsequent months passed without any further breakthrough, Daniel Rowe's disappearance gradually entered a familiar yet no less frightening state for any investigation: silence. No new clue strong enough to change direction, no statement overturning what had been recorded, and no external event forcing the file to expand differently. What remained were old data, screened many times, and assumptions worn down but never replaced. In the investigative environment, silence is not complete cessation, but a prolonged stagnation where efforts occur within narrow bounds and rarely create real movement. Daniel Rowe, from a man suspiciously vanished in central Westminster, began to be reclassified in administrative records. The term missing long-term appeared not as a conclusion, but as an acknowledgement that the case had passed the time threshold where emergency measures could be effective. This classification was technical, but its consequences were very real: priority lowered, resources reallocated to newer cases, and screenings became less frequent. Daniel's file was not closed, but it was no longer on desks daily, no longer the focus of urgent meetings, gradually sliding to the margins of a system handling hundreds of other cases. In this phase, questions that once troubled the team were mentioned less often, not because answers had been found, but because no tools remained to pursue them further. The timeline gaps persisted, the early eliminated routes remained unre-examined seriously, and the sign not belonging to Daniel at the indirect scene lay dormant in the file as an unexplained detail. But without new data, these details lacked the power to pull the case from stagnation. They existed as frozen question marks, neither vanishing nor developing. The file being shelved did not happen suddenly, but through an almost invisible process. At first, meetings grew shorter, then intervals between screenings lengthened. Eventually, Daniel's file was moved to long-term storage, where unsolved cases are kept for possible return upon new information. For the system, this was a necessary step for overall efficiency. But for this specific case, it marked an important boundary. From here, Daniel Rowe was no longer someone who had just vanished, but a name on the list of those missing too long for continued investigation in the original way. In that silence, there was no official statement declaring the case a failure, nor any admission that prior decisions might have been wrong. Everything simply settled, leaving a neatly organized file, with careful notes and provisional conclusions, never fully tested. Daniel Rowe's case became one of many files that younger officers would later skim during training, as an example of an unsolved disappearance, rather than an active investigation. This silence was not merely the absence of action, but the absence of expectation. When no one awaited a turning point any longer, each passing day reinforced the feeling that if an answer existed, it would not emerge from what was already there. And that very fact meant Daniel Rowe's file, though nominally open, was effectively closed in the daily life of the investigative agency. Daniel became a long-term missing person, a recorded name but no longer frequently mentioned, and his case quietly slipped into the shadows of unsolved files, where time brings no answers, only thicker dust over questions, never fully resolved. Many years after Daniel Rowe's file fell into silence, when the case had been placed in the long-term missing category, and was no longer mentioned in daily workflow, one small detail from the night Daniel vanished remained untouched in the file, never properly examined. It was not a clue in the traditional sense. No sign of violence, no clear physical evidence, and certainly not bearing the form of criminal conduct. On the contrary, it was a very minor action, almost mundane, to the extent that in the pressured, data-scarce early days, it was easily deemed irrelevant. No one deliberately overlooked this detail. It simply was not suspicious enough to compete with the larger hypotheses dominating the investigation. This action occurred in the brief interval between the moment Daniel was last seen and the time his family began worrying because he did not return. It left no clear trace, drew no attention, and if viewed in isolation, could be entirely explained by harmless reasons. In the initial file, this detail was recorded only as a subsidiary note, not flagged for priority, not linked to any hypothesis, and not seen as requiring further follow-up. At that time, officers were grappling with bigger questions: where Daniel had gone, why no one saw him, and whether a serious incident had occurred. Compared to those, a small action without clear criminality simply lacked weight. Thus the detail lay dormant in the file for many years, neither rejected nor exploited. It existed as neutral information, neither reinforcing the former dominant hypothesis, nor sufficiently divergent to force anyone to re-ask questions. Only when the case was revisited later, with enough temporal distance to escape the initial assumptions, did this minor action begin to be placed in a different context. When detached from the entire story built around Daniel's disappearance, investigators realized the issue lay not in the action itself, but in who had reason to perform it at that moment. What made this detail noteworthy was not whether it broke the law, but its necessity. For an ordinary person unrelated to Daniel's disappearance, the action offered no clear benefit. It did not help avoid trouble, provided no advantage, and resolved no urgent problem. Indeed, by ordinary logic, most people would have no motive to carry it out in those circumstances. But when placed in the context of someone knowing Daniel would not reappear, its meaning began to shift. It was no longer neutral, but became a preparatory move, a reflex meaningful only if the performer knew what was about to happen would be irreversible. This difference was very subtle, and that was why it had been missed early on. The action did not immediately alter events, produced no obvious consequences, and left no sign prompting questions. But if Daniel had truly been harmed, and if someone was directly involved in his disappearance, then this small action became disturbingly logical. It resembled a detail only someone aware of the outcome would care about. A minor step to adjust the setting, minimize risk, or simply clear the way for remaining unnoticed later. When investigators revisited the file with that perspective, they realized that this detail did not stand alone. It was connected to the gaps in the timeline, to the indirect scene where a sign not belonging to Daniel had been discovered, and to the fact that certain routes had been eliminated too early. Previously, all these elements had been seen as disconnected fragments, not strong enough to alter the investigative direction. But when strung together around the overlooked minor action, they began to form a faint outline, suggesting that someone had actively intervened in the normal flow of that night. Not through a public act of violence, but through small adjustments, discreet enough to go undetected, yet precise enough to serve only one purpose. The most frightening aspect of this detail was that it contradicted none of the hypotheses previously proposed, yet truly fitted none of them either. It did not prove where Daniel disappeared, nor indicate how he was harmed, but it raised a question the previous file had never answered: who benefited from carrying out that action, and in what way? When this question was posed, the scope of suspicion shifted quietly. Instead of focusing on those with opportunity to approach Daniel in open space, the investigation was forced to consider the possibility that someone had acted with deeper knowledge of what was about to happen, enough to perform a minor move that no one else saw as necessary. For many years, this detail existed as a faint line in the file, not underlined, not highlighted in red, and not mentioned in summaries. But its very ordinariness concealed an uncomfortable truth: if there was no criminal act, then the action was superfluous. Yet if there was a criminal act, the action became disturbingly logical. The difference between these two interpretations lay not in the detail itself, but in the overall context of the case, a context shaped for years by flawed assumptions and uncorrected directions. When the Daniel Rowe case was revisited with fresh eyes, the minor detail overlooked on the night of the disappearance was no longer a harmless note. It became a sign of intent, of calculation, and of the possibility that someone knew more than they had shown. Not every suspicious action bears the mark of crime, but sometimes the seemingly meaningless actions are precisely those only a perpetrator would need to carry out. And in Daniel's file, that detail lay there for many years, quietly waiting for someone patient and skeptical enough to realize that its harmlessness only existed if one believed nothing wrongful had happened on the night Daniel vanished. Many years after Daniel Rowe was classified as long-term missing, the decision to reopen the file did not come from public pressure, nor from a media campaign, or any public appeal. There was no new article, no figure suddenly speaking out, and no chance discovery forcing authorities to respond. The reopening stemmed from a purely professional reason, discreet and imperceptible to those not directly involved in investigations: an internal contradiction in the file, present from the start, but never satisfactorily explained. During a routine review alongside numerous other files, that very contradiction caused an investigator to pause longer than usual, not because it was new, but because it had never been resolved. A cold case review is not a complete reinvestigation in the usual sense. It begins by rereading the file as if no dominant hypothesis had ever been established, detaching each detail from the story built around it. In that process, the investigators realized that many key operational decisions in the early months had been based on assumptions never fully tested, and when those assumptions were placed alongside raw data, they no longer fitted as before. The most prominent contradiction lay not in a false statement or lost evidence, but in how time and space markers were pieced together to form a seamless sequence, even though they had never truly aligned. One point that drew the review team's attention was the discrepancy between the official timeline and indirect data collected on the night Daniel vanished. The timeline assumed Daniel followed a specific route and disappeared in a very short window after the last seen point, yet the unexplained gaps in that timeline had never been filled with actual evidence. Previously, those gaps were seen as the natural result of missing witnesses, but upon re-examination, they contradicted the very argument that the incident happened quickly and near the last seen point. If everything occurred rapidly in a confined space, there should have been at least one clearer indirect sign, rather than the prolonged fading the file recorded. The second contradiction lay in how the indirect scene was handled. The sign not belonging to Daniel, found at a point he certainly passed, had been noted but never brought to the center of analysis. In the old file, this detail existed as an exception, not strong enough to change direction, yet unexplained as to why it appeared there. When the review team asked the simple question, if this sign was unrelated, why did it exist precisely at the most logical intermediate point in Daniel's route, they realized the file had never provided a clear operational answer. It was not excluded by evidence, but merely sidelined for not fitting the dominant hypothesis. The overlooked detail from the night of the disappearance, the minor action without clear criminality, was also brought back to the analysis table. Previously, it was deemed insignificant because it broke no law and had no immediate consequences. But when placed alongside the timeline and indirect scene contradictions, the review team realized this detail acted as an untapped connecting point. It occurred exactly in the interval the file could not account for Daniel's whereabouts, and held real meaning only if the performer knew Daniel would not reappear. The fact that this detail had never been operationally explained, nor logically excluded, became a clear gap in the file. What made reopening the case necessary was not vague suspicion, but the accumulation of small contradictions, each insufficient alone to alter conclusions, but together forming an unavoidable picture. The review team realized Daniel Rowe's file had not failed due to lack of effort, but due to excessive consistency with an early chosen direction. Operational decisions reasonable at each moment, when viewed overall, revealed a closed trajectory where contradictions were not resolved, but covered by convenient interpretations. Reopening the file was thus not emotional or political, but a necessary adjustment to address unanswered questions. The cold case review established a new principle for Daniel Rowe's case: assume nothing until independently verified. This meant many provisional conclusions in the old file would need dismantling, not to wholly deny prior work, but to detach them from the hypothesis that had dominated previous understanding. Markers once deemed certain were returned to needs confirmation status, early eliminated routes were reinstated for consideration, and minor details once seen as harmless were re-evaluated for motive and context. When the decision to reopen was formalized, it came without grand statements or public commitments. For those in the cold case review, it was quiet work requiring patience and willingness to admit that what was once believed correct might have led the case astray. But that very admission gave the reopening meaning. It allowed Daniel Rowe's case to escape the frame that had kept it stagnant for years, not due to external pressure, but because internal operational contradictions remained unexplained, and until resolved, the case could not be considered properly understood. When Daniel Rowe's file was officially reopened under the cold case review, the team's first action was not seeking new clues, but returning to old data with entirely different logic. The goal of this second timeline reconstruction was not to prove or disprove an existing hypothesis, but to strip all assumptions from the data and see what truly remained standing without being forced to fit a preset scenario. Time markers once deemed certain were returned to neutral status, no longer labeled confirmed, but re-evaluated piece by piece, source by source, observation condition by condition. This time, the timeline was built not as a seamless straight line, but as a collection of independent time blocks, connected only when objective evidence was strong enough. In this process, the team realized much old data had never been wrong, but had been interpreted in the way most convenient for the prior hypothesis. The key witness's statement, once used to fix Daniel's direction, was restored to its proper role, confirming Daniel's presence at a specific moment, not his entire subsequent journey. The indirect scene discovery was re-examined, not as evidence of an incident there, but as an intersection where Daniel's path might have touched another factor. The overlooked minor action from the disappearance night was placed in its correct temporal position, rather than sidelined. When these data were placed together without being forced to tell one story, one thing became clearer: the timeline gaps were not a single void, but a prolonged blind spot where Daniel did not vanish suddenly, but gradually fell out of the file's view. It was within that blind spot that a presence began to emerge. Not a new name, not a figure never before in the file, but someone there from very early, appearing scattered in old data, but never considered a continuous factor. As the second timeline took shape, the team began marking every data point, not about Daniel, but about others present in the same time and space frames. Previously, these presences were seen as random, insufficient to form a chain, but without the assumption Daniel vanished at a fixed point, they began reconnecting differently. This person did not appear at one spot, but repeatedly at various markers, always at the edge of time gaps, always close enough to be relevant, yet never prominent enough to draw notice. What made this presence noteworthy was not frequency, but consistency. In minutes the old file could not place Daniel. This person appeared indirectly through subsidiary data, a location note, a mention in another statement, a seemingly unrelated detail in initial reports. Each appearance was too minor to raise suspicion alone, but in the new timeline, they formed a parallel line to Daniel's journey, running through the blind spot the previous investigation had never illuminated. The team realized they were not facing a complete void, but one filled by a person they previously had no reason to suspect. Identifying this person came not in a flash of insight, but through meticulous comparison. The review team cross-checked timing, location, and context of each appearance, testing whether any could be definitively excluded. But the more they checked, the more this person not only coincidentally appeared, but disturbingly fitted what the file had never explained. This person had legitimate reason to be in Westminster that night, freedom to move between spaces Daniel might have passed, and most importantly, sufficient trust not to be questioned early on. In the old file, that trust was seen as neutral, even positive, helping eliminate a potential suspect. But in the new logic, that very trust became why this person was never considered part of the problem. As the second timeline neared completion, the team realized the figure repeatedly appearing in the blind spot was not a stranger, but someone once deemed beyond suspicion. Their presence was not hidden, not furtive, and broke no rule enough to draw attention. But that very fact made them perfect for slipping through initial suspicion filters. For years, Daniel Rowe's file was built on seeking a stranger, an external factor explaining sudden disappearance. The new timeline revealed a harder possibility. Daniel's disappearance might be linked to someone very close, close enough not to be seen as a threat. This realization did not lead immediately to a conclusion, but completely shifted the investigation's focus. Instead of asking where Daniel went and what happened, questions turned to who shared his time frame unnoticed, who was present long enough to influence his path without clear traces. The second timeline, with new logic, was no longer about filling gaps, but identifying what had been present within them. And in this reconstruction, a troubling truth gradually emerged. The figure consistently in the blind spot was not a random presence from Westminster night in 1993, but someone once trusted, once deemed unrelated, and thus outside every hypothesis for many years. As the timeline was reconstructed for the second time, and the blind spot began to take clearer shape, an unavoidable consequence emerged. The name once eliminated returned to the center of the file. This was not a newly discovered suspect, but someone who had appeared very early in the initial days of the 1993 investigation. Briefly considered, then swiftly struck from the list in line with the logic of the dominant hypothesis at the time. For many years, the elimination of this person had never been questioned, not because it was proven correct, but because there was no practical reason to revisit it. Only when the new timeline exposed this person's continuous presence in the blind spot did the old elimination decision come under serious scrutiny. The old file showed the reason for eliminating this suspect in 1993 quite clearly, and at the time entirely reasonably. The person was deemed trustworthy, had a clear connection to Daniel Rowe, and was assessed as having no obvious criminal motive. Their explanations of whereabouts and activities on the night Daniel vanished did not directly contradict the data then available, and more importantly, did not conflict with the assumption that Daniel had disappeared quickly and near the last seen point. In the context of an investigation needing to narrow scope, eliminating someone who did not fit the dominant scenario was a time and resource-saving step. There was no clear sign of lying, no recorded violent behavior, and no physical evidence requiring this person to remain on the suspect list. But when the cold case review reset the entire file on new logic, the reasons once seen as strong enough for elimination began revealing fundamental weaknesses. First, this suspect's trustworthiness had never been independently verified, relying mainly on operational instinct and relational context. The person was not suspected because they did not resemble the perpetrator profile the investigation was then seeking. Second, explanations of their movements that night had only been cross-checked against the dominant hypothesis, never rigorously tested in an alternative scenario. When that hypothesis was dismantled, explanations once seeming harmless suddenly became ambiguous, not because they contradicted anything, but because they were no longer supported by a preset narrative. Re-examining the 1993 elimination decision also exposed another critical factor: timing. This person was removed from the suspect list very early, before much key data emerged, or was properly understood. This meant all subsequent information about them was recorded in a state of already eliminated, so new details were never linked back to this name. Their presence in the old timeline's blind spot was thus not seen as anomalous, merely coincidental. When the second timeline revealed the repetition of that presence, the team realized they were not facing a new discovery, but a chain of data that had existed from the start, yet been obscured by an overly early operational decision. Another pivotal point in re-evaluating this suspect was their connection to the minor detail overlooked on the night Daniel vanished. Previously, that detail had not been attached to any specific individual, as no one saw need to trace motive for an action without clear criminality. But when placing the returning suspect back into that exact time and space frame, the minor action suddenly acquired an agent. It was no longer an anonymous event, but a choice potentially tied to a specific person, one with enough information and position to see that action as necessary. This proved nothing about crime, but it shattered the old argument that no one had reason to perform it. The deeper the team delved into dissecting the 1993 elimination decision, the more they realized the error lay not in a single assessment, but in how that assessment was shielded from re-examination. Eliminating this suspect became a fixed point in the file, not because proven correct, but because never challenged. When the dominant hypothesis governed the entire direction, there was no incentive to revisit decisions that had helped tidy the file. Only when new logic demanded understanding the blind spot rather than avoiding it, did the once eliminated name return with its full weight. By the end of this phase, the team no longer viewed the suspect's return as a setback, but as a necessary correction. The 1993 elimination, when revisited in the context of fuller data, no longer stood as a firm decision. It relied too heavily on fitting an early chosen hypothesis, and too little on independently verifying what this person truly did, truly knew, and truly could have influenced on the night Daniel Rowe vanished. The return of the once eliminated name brought no immediate accusation, but marked a significant shift in the investigation. For the first time, the file had to confront the possibility that what had been deemed safe and trustworthy had concealed a vital link to the truth. When the once eliminated name returned to the center of the file, the cold case team understood clearly that any public move at this stage could ruin everything they had just rebuilt. The suspect was not a stranger, not someone on society's fringes, and certainly not the type to draw attention if approached directly. Therefore, the chosen strategy for this phase was not interrogation, not confrontation, but a silent, patient, almost invisible investigation. The goal was not to force the suspect to say anything, but to let the data speak, to allow what had existed for years but never been connected to stand together in the same logical frame. The team began by regathering all indirect traces related to the suspect, not only from the night Daniel Rowe vanished, but from the periods before and after. They were not seeking clear criminal conduct, knowing that if such existed, it could not have remained undetected for years. What they sought were minor deviations, subtle shifts in routine, in accounts, in how the suspect interacted with the surrounding context. Each detail, alone, could be harmless, but placed together in chronological order, they might form a chain no longer easily explained by chance. One of the first focuses of the silent investigation was the suspect's presence in the timeline's blind spot. The team did not ask where the suspect had been, but cross-referenced what the old file recorded with what could be independently verified: schedules, locations, reasons given for that presence. Previously, these data were seen as neutral because they did not contradict the dominant hypothesis. Now, with that hypothesis gone, that very neutrality became the issue. For if nothing needed hiding, continuous presence during intervals when Daniel could not be placed should yield a clearer explanation than the vague answers existing for years. Next was cross-referencing the suspect with the minor detail overlooked on the disappearance night. The team did not try to prove the suspect performed that action, but asked whether the suspect had the conditions to do so: presence at the right moment, access, real motive to see it as necessary. As these factors were layered, a worrying fit gradually emerged. There was no direct evidence tying the suspect to the action, but neither was there any factor convincingly excluding the possibility. In silent investigation, inability to exclude can be as important as confirmation. The team also rescreened how the suspect had been trusted in the early phase. That trust was not purely instinctive, but built from position, role and relationship to Daniel and the Westminster context. But upon review, they realized that very trust had created an unofficial safe zone, where the suspect's behaviors and explanations were not scrutinized as rigorously as others. The silent investigation thus focused on dismantling this safe zone, not through confrontation, but by subjecting all suspect-related data to the same verification standard as any other subject. Time was the key factor of this phase. There was no pressure to act quickly, as the case had lain dormant for years. Instead, the team used time to gather a chain of indirect evidence, long and consistent enough to defy coincidence. They sought repetition, the same explanation pattern for gaps, the same presence mode at critical moments, the same subtle avoidance when the file neared hard questions. Each repetition alone lacked proof value, but as numbers grew, the chain's value surpassed individual links. The most important aspect of silent investigation was that it allowed the file to develop without triggering defensive reaction from the suspect. No interrogation meant no statements retractable or adjustable. No confrontation meant no tense moment for preparation. Everything gathered came from what already existed: old files, objective data, and what the suspect had left over years without expecting reconnection this way. This was not a race to arrest, but building a foundation solid enough that when action came, it rested on logic hard to refute, not feeling or guesswork. As the silent investigation phase progressed, the Daniel Rowe file began taking a shape utterly different from before. Instead of revolving around one lone hypothesis, it became a web of indirect connections, where the suspect no longer appeared as an eliminated name, but as an unavoidable intersection of multiple independent data chains. No confession, no revealing act, but also no longer the former ambiguity. Silent investigation created no immediate climax, but laid groundwork for an inevitable turning point, where truth, if existing, would have nowhere left to hide behind assumptions that had protected it for years. After many months of silent investigation, when indirect evidence chains had thickened sufficiently, yet still not crossed the actionable threshold, the Daniel Rowe case entered its most sensitive phase. This was not the moment for spectacular evidence or shocking discovery, but when a very minor detail, silently existing in the file for years, was placed in the position no one had previously seen. Alone, this detail was insufficient to charge anyone. It broke no law, proved no violence, and could even be explained by wholly harmless reasons. But fitted into the formed indirect evidence structure, it became the decisive piece, closing the final gaps the suspect could still evade. That detail related directly to the time and space when Daniel Rowe fell from the file's view. In old documents, it was recorded only as a subsidiary event, unattached to any individual, and not deemed suspicious. But in the new investigation's logic, the detail was examined not for nature, but necessity. The team posed a simple yet pivotal question: in the specific circumstances of Daniel's disappearance night, who truly needed to perform that action? When placed beside what was known about the returning suspect, the answer was no longer open-ended. What made this piece decisive was resolving a contradiction persisting for years. Previously, the file could not explain why Daniel vanished without clear signs, nor convincingly account for the suspect's continuous presence in the timeline's blind spot. This minor detail, correctly placed, did not directly state the suspect caused anything, but showed the suspect had knowledge and motive to adjust context beneficially. It linked the overlooked minor action to prolonged presence, turning two seemingly disparate factors into two sides of the same intentional choice. When this piece was added to the evidence map, the team saw clearly remaining escape routes for the suspect closed one by one. Previously, each unfavorable detail could be explained independently. Presence in the blind spot could be coincidence, the minor action that night harmless, vague explanations due to faded memory over time. But when the decisive piece connected them, those explanations no longer held simultaneously. If the suspect were innocent, the chain of coincidences needed to explain. Everything became too long and specific to accept reasonably. Importantly, the team did not rush to elevate this detail to direct evidence. They understood its strength lay not in standing alone in court, but in locking the argumentative structure. This piece forced every alternative hypothesis to face the same hard question: if not the suspect, then who else was present at the right moment, capable of that action, continuously appearing in the timeline's blind spot, and benefiting from Daniel never reappearing? Until then, no answer passed this test. Upon rescreening the entire file with the new piece centrally placed, the team realized they no longer needed excessive speculation about what happened. They did not know every exact step, every moment of Daniel's disappearance night, and perhaps never would fully. But what they now had was a consistent indirect evidence structure, where each detail supported the others, and denying one factor would collapse the entire alternative explanation. This was the fundamental difference from the prior phase, when the file relied on one lone hypothesis. This time, there was no single central assumption, but a self-reinforcing logical web. The decisive piece also forced the team to confront greater responsibility. Advancing now was not merely operational, but acknowledging that the Daniel Rowe case, long seen as deadlocked, had actually contained the solution in overlooked details. The decision to act could not rest on feeling enough, but on every reasonable escape route for the suspect being closed by data, not guesswork. When the final piece was placed correctly, the file was no longer a collection of scattered suspicions, but a closed picture, where further waiting would only erode what had been built. By the end of this phase, the team understood they had reached the final boundary between investigation and action. The decisive piece not only clarified direction, but defined timing. Continuing silence would once again let the file stagnate. Acting required readiness to defend the entire evidence structure against the strictest standards. But unlike before, there was no longer ambiguity. When the piece fitted and every reasonable escape route closed, the choice was no longer whether to proceed, but how to make the next step precise, cautious, and irreversible. The decision to arrest was not made in a moment of impulse or under pressure to create a dramatic turning point. After the decisive piece was placed in its correct position, and the indirect evidence structure had closed, the investigation team took additional time to choose the most suitable moment. This was not hesitation, but the final step of a strategy built from very early in the silent investigation phase. They understood that acting too soon, when the file was not yet stable enough, could cause years of effort to collapse over a minor error, and acting too late risked the suspect noticing something unusual and adjusting their behavior. The chosen moment was not for convenience, but because it was optimal for ensuring everything occurred under absolute control. The arrest took place without chase, without sirens blaring in the streets, and without a public confrontation. The suspect was not approached in a highly defensive state, nor was there any sign they realized they were being watched. This precisely reflected the nature of the entire investigation: discreet, calculated, and based on allowing the other side to continue living in the belief they remained beyond suspicion. When the officers appeared, they needed little explanation and no recourse to force. The arrest was neat by the book, and so swift that those around only realized something had happened once it was over. News of the arrest spread through Westminster in a way no one had predicted, not because of a dramatic street scene, but because the name arrested was not a stranger. This was someone once trusted, deemed beyond suspicion for years, and that very fact made the event create a wave of silent but profound shock. Westminster, accustomed to major shifts in politics and power, rarely witnessed a jolt from a case long thought forgotten. The everyday quiet of the administrative district was suddenly broken by whispered questions, brief conversations, and the sense that something long buried had been dragged into the light. What made the arrest special was not its scale, but its context. Daniel Rowe had been missing for over 2 decades, and his case long regarded as a cold file unlikely to progress. The arrest at this time was not merely a legal step, but a complete reversal of expectations for those who had followed the case. No media campaign, no grand police statement, yet information spread quickly due to its sheer unexpectedness. People began looking back at the preceding years differently, wondering what had been overlooked and why it had taken so long to reach this moment. For the investigation team, the arrest brought no immediate sense of triumph, no complete relief, as they knew this was only the start of a new phase where every piece of indirect evidence would face scrutiny harsher than ever. But one thing was undeniable: after years of silence, the Daniel Rowe case had officially left stagnation. The arrest was a clear sign. The file was no longer dormant in storage, but back at the center of attention, not just internally within the agency, but in the Westminster community itself. Westminster's shock came not from what happened on the streets, but from what the arrest implied. It raised questions about the safety of assumptions once deemed certain, how trust could become a shield for truth, and the price paid when a minor detail was overlooked on that fateful night in 1993. As the suspect was taken away, there was no loud noise, but in the minds of those aware of the case, a different echo began spreading, the feeling that a long chapter of silence had finally closed, opening a new one, where truth, however belated, would have to be confronted. The interrogation began not long after the suspect's arrest, but bore none of the tense confrontation many imagine. The team had prepared for this phase over many months, knowing their strength lay not in coercion or pressure, but in letting the file itself guide the conversation. The questioning tactic was built on a simple principle: no direct confrontation with major suspicions, no rush to accuse, but starting from minor familiar details the suspect believed they could control. The goal was not immediate confession, but allowing them to step into contradictions existing for years, contradictions never before placed side by side. Initial questions revolved around the general context of the night Daniel Rowe vanished, posed in a neutral tone, almost reminiscent. The suspect was asked to recount that night in their own way, uninterrupted, uncorrected. The team let the story flow, knowing what mattered lay not in what was said, but in how the story was constructed. The initial account held no surprises: familiar timelines, explanations from the old file, gaps filled with familiar vagueness. For years these very explanations had kept the suspect beyond suspicion, and they seemed to believe they would continue to work. Once the story was told, the tactic shifted subtly. Investigators did not point out contradictions immediately, but returned to each detail, each minor time marker, asking the suspect to clarify seemingly unimportant points. Questions were not accusatory, but framed as interest in accuracy. Here, minor differences began emerging. A detail emphasized more than before, a time interval shortened or lengthened, compared to old statements, an action explained with a new reason. Individually, these changes could be seen as natural effects of fading memory over time, but together, they formed the chain of discrepancies the team had long awaited. Contradictions did not explode, but accumulated gradually. The team revisited points where the suspect had once been deemed most trustworthy, details that justified elimination from the 1993 suspect list. When asked again, the suspect began adjusting their account to fit data the team presented, but each adjustment triggered new consequences. A new explanation inadvertently contradicted an old one. A clarified interval no longer matched the suspect's presence in the timeline's blind spot. No shouting, no coercion, only a growing sense the story was becoming harder to control. The interrogation's pivotal moment came when the team presented the decisive piece, not directly. They did not call it incriminating evidence, but simply asked the suspect to explain its existence in the context of Daniel's disappearance night. The question was neutral, as if merely a missing part needing clarification to complete the file. The suspect's reaction was what mattered. Instead of outright denial or simple explanation, they began saying too much, trying to justify not just that action, but things the question had not mentioned. In attempting to control the narrative, they inadvertently confirmed connections the team had never publicly stated. At that point, the interrogation entered a different phase. Investigators needed no further new evidence, as the suspect's own statements began linking to the indirect evidence structure. What had previously existed as possibility was now reinforced by how the suspect described actions and motives. A detail once potentially harmless was placed in a context only someone aware of Daniel's outcome would see as necessary. The suspect did not confess directly, but each answer, each explanatory effort gradually narrowed the innocent space they could occupy. Contradictions no longer lay between statements over years, but within the ongoing conversation. The team let the suspect realize their current words no longer matched prior ones, and more importantly, no longer matched objective reality. When asked about presence in the timeline's blind spot, the suspect offered an explanation denying involvement, but that very explanation confirmed presence at a moment previously claimed absent. When asked about the overlooked minor action that night, the suspect tried minimizing its importance, but inadvertently revealed deeper understanding of its consequences than an ordinary innocent would have. The interrogation did not end with a clear confession, but needed none. What mattered was that by the session's end, the suspect had self-validated the indirect evidence through their own words. What the team built over months was no longer an external logical structure, but reinforced internally by the interrogated person's inconsistencies and excessive knowledge. As the suspect left the room, the team knew they had crossed a vital boundary, from database suspicion to a file where the suspect's statements no longer stood outside evidence, but became part of it. For the Daniel Rowe case, this interrogation brought no sense of closure, but certainty. For years, the file lacked a key element linking disparate details into a robust story. Now the suspect, through contradictions and self-revelation in statements, had filled that gap. No direct confession, no dramatic moment needed. Truth emerged quietly, but undeniably, laying groundwork for the case's next phase, where everything would face not interrogation room resolution, but the strictest standards of justice. The trial opened without the dramatic atmosphere of a case involving a weapon, a body, or direct witnesses, but rather resembled a prolonged intellectual challenge where everything was placed on the scales of logic. The prosecution understood clearly that their greatest weakness was not lack of data, but the passage of time. More than 2 decades since the night Daniel Rowe vanished was a delay long enough to sow doubt in any argument. Therefore, the prosecution's strategy was not to attempt vividly recreating every moment, but to string together the entire timeline with tight logic, where each detail, however small, had its place and function. They did not promise to show the jury exactly what happened in every minute of that night in 1993, but asked the jury to answer a simpler yet harsher question: whether there was any other reasonable explanation for this chain of events. The prosecution began by reconstructing the second timeline, not the original one from 1993. They explained clearly why the initial assumptions had led the investigation astray, and why the early elimination of the suspect had created a blind spot lasting many years. Before the jury, the timeline was no longer a smooth straight line, but a structure of certain markers interspersed with gaps, and the way those gaps were filled by new logic was the focus. The prosecution pointed out that Daniel Rowe did not vanish at the last seen point as the old file had asserted, but fell out of society's view in a continuous sequence of developments, where the defendant's presence appeared repeatedly in precisely the intervals unexplained by other data. Each piece was placed on the table before the jury. The indirect scene Daniel certainly passed through, the sign not belonging to Daniel yet fitting the defendant's presence, the minor action on the disappearance night without clear criminality, but meaningful only if the performer knew Daniel would not return. The prosecution did not call these decisive evidence, but presented them as independent factors, each potentially explainable innocently alone, but together forming an inseparable chain. The emphasis in the prosecution's argument was not a single act, but the consistency of the entire structure. If the defendant were innocent, all these details would have to be coincidences, errors, or random simultaneously. The prosecution asked the jury to consider whether that level of coincidence remained reasonable. The defense responded with a familiar yet powerful strategy, attacking the time delay. They emphasized that the case had no body, no direct witnesses, no decisive physical evidence, and that the entire prosecution argument was built on indirect inferences after more than 20 years. The defense questioned the reliability of memory, the possibility of data being misinterpreted over time, and the risk that the new investigation had unwittingly read non-existent meanings into old details. They repeatedly noted that if these details truly held decisive value, why had they not led to a clear conclusion in 1993, when memories were fresh and the context intact? The defense also tried to undermine the prosecution's logical structure by isolating each piece. They pointed out that every detail could be explained innocently, if standing alone, and that the law does not allow conviction based on a feeling of no escape without direct evidence. The time delay was used as a shield. The more years passed, the harder to distinguish objective truth from later formed interpretation. According to the defense, the very reopening of the file after many years created risk of bias, where investigators, though well-intentioned, might have been guided by desire for an answer more than pure data. The logical battle became clearest when the prosecution rebutted this point. They acknowledged the time delay as a challenge, but argued that that very delay had allowed revisiting the file unbound by initial flawed assumptions. The prosecution stressed they were not asking the jury to trust anyone's memory, but the data's consistency under new logic. Contradictions in the defendant's interrogation statements were presented not as a confession, but as confirmation the defendant had knowledge and presence exceeding what an innocent person could have. The prosecution argued that if time delay justified doubting all evidence, it must apply fairly to every innocent explanation the defense offered. As the trial neared deliberation, the jury were not asked to answer what exactly happened that night, but which logic holds stronger. They had to weigh two possibilities: either Daniel Rowe vanished due to an inexplicable chain of coincidences, or his disappearance resulted from intentional choices by someone once trusted and thus unsuspected. The prosecution did not claim their logic perfect, but that it was the only one leaving no unreasonable gaps. The defense could not offer an equally coherent alternative story, only pointing out uncertainties in the prosecution's. Ultimately, the jury's decision rested not on an emotional moment or sensational detail, but cold consideration of probability and reasonableness. They had to ask whether they could accept all prosecution-presented pieces as merely random. When returning to court to deliver the verdict, there was no loud noise, no dramatic reaction, but the jury's choice spoke the trial's most important truth. In a case without direct witnesses or decisive physical evidence, consistent logic, built from overlooked details and unexplained contradictions, can be stronger than time. When the jury's verdict was delivered, the truth about the Westminster night in 1993 was no longer a collection of disparate hypotheses, but a chain of events reconstructible coherently. This was not truth revealed by dramatic confession or hidden sensational detail, but truth formed from logic, minor choices, and placing one person in the exact context of that night. When all pieces fitted correctly, the final picture emerged, without needing violent description to haunt, for its very ordinariness was the most frightening. That night, Daniel Rowe left the Whitehall area as many times before, carrying no sense his life was about to veer differently. What followed was not a sudden street incident, but a sequence of interactions in space and time the initial file had misassessed. Daniel did not vanish at the last seen point, nor suddenly drop from the world in an inexplicable moment. He continued moving, continuing to exist in the city, but from a certain point onward, that existence was no longer recorded by any system society trusts to affirm a person's being. The truth showed Daniel encountered the right person at the right moment. The 1993 investigation lacked tools and perspective to recognize. That person was not a stranger emerging from shadows, but one already holding trust, enough not to arouse alertness, enough to leave no unusual sign in others' eyes. The encounter occurred not in chaos or danger, but in a seemingly safe, familiar setting, where Daniel had no reason to suspect minor choices would lead to irreversible consequences. Subsequent actions that night bore no mark of elaborate pre-planning, but resembled decisions made in short time, based on specific circumstances and understanding of outcomes. This explained no clear traces of coercion or conflict, and why the initial investigation found no traditional crime scene. Daniel was not severed from the world by public violence, but pushed out of recording systems, out of checkpoints society relies on to confirm human existence. This chain also clarified the overlooked minor action on the disappearance night, once seen without clear criminality. In the full picture, it was no longer meaningless, but a key step ensuring Daniel would not be found conventionally. Not to erase all traces, but to gain time, space and silence long enough that what happened could not be immediately reconstructed. That was why the action held meaning only viewed from the perspective of someone knowing Daniel would not return. The truth about the 1993 Westminster night also explained why the suspect lived years beyond suspicion. Not because perfect, but because their actions fitted the flawed assumptions the initial investigation accepted. When the file believed Daniel vanished quickly at a fixed point, anything not fitting was sidelined. The delay in re-asking correct questions let truth exist in the file unseen. Most important in fully reconstructing the chain was not pinpointing every minute, every step, but understanding the disappearance's nature. Daniel did not vanish meaninglessly, nor as victim of random mishap or absurd coincidences. His disappearance tied to another's choices, specific circumstances, and an investigative system missing the chance to see what unfolded before its eyes. When truth fitted correct context, it no longer resembled metaphysical mystery, but outcome of very human, everyday decisions. Understanding this truth brought no complete relief, no final image of Daniel, no moment closing all questions, but it brought something more important: acknowledgement. Daniel was not forgotten by indifferent fate, but by nameable errors. The truth about the 1993 Westminster night does not erase loss, but restores Daniel Rowe as a person with a story, cause, and responsibility tied to his disappearance. When the chain was fully reconstructed, the case was no longer where did Daniel go, but why was he not found sooner? And in that answer lay not only one individual's responsibility, but a bitter lesson: small unchecked assumptions can swallow a person from history for decades. When the Daniel Rowe file was officially closed, the feeling left behind was not one of complete fulfillment, but an ending carrying many heavy layers. The case had been resolved in a legal sense, the core questions had answers, and the chain of events from the Westminster night, in 1993, had been reconstructed with logic solid enough to stand in court. But closing the file did not erase the initial mistakes that had shaped the investigation's fate for decades. On the contrary, it was precisely when everything became clear that those mistakes emerged fully and inescapably. The greatest error lay not in lack of effort, but in an assumption accepted too early and too readily. The initial investigation quickly believed Daniel vanished at the last seen point, and from then on every operational decision revolved around that assumption. Rotes eliminated, minor details deemed unimportant, and trustworthy people placed beyond suspicion, not because of excluding evidence, but because they did not fit the chosen scenario. When a wrong assumption becomes the foundation, the entire structure above it, however carefully built, cannot lead to truth. The file falling into cold case status was not the result of one clear moment of failure, but the consequence of a series of choices reasonable in the short term yet wrong in the long term. Each individual decision could be explained by the context and limitations of its time, but accumulated, they created inertia, rendering the file incapable of self-correction. The name once eliminated early became something resolved, not because proven innocent, but because no one had reason to revisit questions. The file's prolonged silence was thus not lack of clues, but lack of a new perspective bold enough to challenge what had been deemed certain. It took decades for the case to be solved, not only because time had passed, but because a fundamental shift in viewing data was needed. Only when the cold case review forced confrontation with unexplained operational contradictions was the file reopened with a different spirit, not defending old decisions, but re-examining them. The timeline reconstructed a second time, overlooked details placed at the center, and trust once a shield became the subject of scrutiny. Truth did not emerge from new evidence, but from old evidence finally seen correctly. When the file closed, no one on the team regarded it as a perfect victory. Daniel Rowe did not return, and the years of his absence could not be restored to his family or himself. Justice, however belated, could only answer what happened, not fill the void his disappearance left. Every solved case carries a paradox, clarity arriving too late to fully soothe what was lost. The Daniel Rowe file closed with a heavy lesson for investigators. Small assumptions, if not continually tested, can lead an entire case astray for decades. Trust, without verification, can become the most dangerous blind spot. And a file's silence does not always mean no answers remain, but sometimes merely that the right questions were never asked. A case solved, a sentence pronounced, yet the void Daniel Rowe left persists, unfilled by paperwork or verdict. Closing the file is not the story's full stop, but acknowledgement that some losses cannot be repaired, only named and remembered. In that final silence, the Daniel Rowe file remains as a cold reminder: justice may come late, but the price of delay is sometimes an entire life swallowed by time. The Daniel Rowe story is not merely a cold case solved after decades, but a clear mirror reflecting how modern society in the United Kingdom operates, and the dangerous blind spots still existing today. The 1993 Westminster in the story symbolizes assumed safety, the central administrative district, yellow lights, no conflict, no signs of violence. That very normality caused Daniel's disappearance to be underestimated from the start, and the wrong assumption he vanished at the last seen point led the entire investigation astray for decades. In today's modern UK life, we often do the same, believing familiar spaces, trustworthy people, and long-running systems need no re-questioning. The most important lesson from this case is the danger of unverified trust. The person once trusted in the story, repeatedly appearing in the timeline's blind spot, yet unsuspected, reminds us that reputation, social position, or acquaintance cannot replace independent checking. In today's life, from workplaces, schools, to local communities in the UK, many serious issues persist, not from lack of information, but because people hesitate to question what is already decided. The Daniel Rowe story also shows the value of revisiting old data with fresh thinking. Only when the cold case review dared dismantle initial assumptions was the timeline correctly rebuilt and truth revealed. This is especially relevant to modern British society, where organizations, local authorities, and individuals must learn that a reasonable past decision is not always right forever. Ultimately, the most painful lesson is that time does not automatically bring justice. If we do not actively re-examine gaps and overlook details, silence will continue swallowing people. As Daniel vanished from life for years, not because meaningless, but because the system did not look closely enough. If you believe stories like Daniel Rowe deserve retelling to remind us never to ignore truth's gaps, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next cases. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where another seemingly forgotten file will be opened.